Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're here as the ADL team to talk about the newest trend in bias and hate incidents, unfortunately. We're talking about video teleconferencing hijacking, which is commonly known as Zoom bombing, but it can happen on any platform. So even if we use the term Zoom bombing, make sure to look at the security features and the processes for the platform that you're using. So Zoom bombing, as with other types of hateful messaging, of course, targets historically marginalized groups. And so we're thinking now, especially at this time, at the end of the year, about keeping our end of year cultural center and student group celebrations just that, celebrations, and not targets for non-inclusive or bias motivated behavior. So to keep our virtual community safe, ADL is tracking the trends, and we're here to share some best practices for prevention and response. Hey, Oren, can you give us some examples of what ADL has been tracking?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alyssa. One of the manifestations of hate that we're seeing a lot of during this pandemic is Zoom bombing, as Alyssa mentioned. Now, we need to define our terms. What this refers to is this video conferencing platform that we're literally using right now, and how in some cases there are trolls, there are extremists and others who are disrupting these meetings with graphic images, with threatening messages, and often this is including hate speech. Now I want to show you what this looks like because it's really important to understand what you may encounter. But the warning, this is pretty graphic stuff. So in some cases, what people will do, the techniques that they'll use, is to display offensive content, including screen sharing, like I'm doing now. Or they might use the chat function to put hateful messages. They might use annotations where they'll scrawl swastikas, pornographic images, etc. In some cases, they may even unmute themselves and try to disrupt by using racial epithets or otherwise disrupting with their voices. It's not always one person. Sometimes it's multiple people who come in. A lot of times it's not extremists, but those who are using language, using epithets, using narratives and images that are consistent with extremists. But whether it's trolls or the extremists themselves, what this does is disrupt a meeting and make people feel uncomfortable on a platform and in a moment where communication and safety is really important. But there are ways to protect ourselves, and that's what we're here for. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to be able to explain some of that. Hey, Lauren, can you take it away from here?
Thanks so much, Oren. As Oren talked about, video teleconferencing hijacking can be really difficult. So what we recommend is to make a plan for these end of year celebrations. They can vary in size and in length. And so there's no one size fits all measure to take in order to avoid video teleconferencing hijacking. But what's really good is there are a lot of features that you can set up and things you can think about before an event occurs to make sure it's as safe and enjoyable as possible. So first, make a plan. And one thing we recommend is, regardless of the size of the event, have a co-host. So you can have an additional person with all of the security features that Dave's going to talk about in a minute to make sure and monitor each event so that it really becomes just what Alyssa talked about, a celebration. In addition to having a co-host, make sure that whatever platform you're using is up to date. So all of the features and system updates have been put in place before the event occurs, because that makes sure that all of those defaults or new settings are already auto-filtered into your platform. Additionally, think about what kind of invitation you're sending out. It's really easy for an individual to hijack a meeting if invitations and links are widely disseminated. So make sure that you have invitations, you know where they're being sent out to. There's also an ability to put a password in those invitations and send that out at a later date. So those are some things to think about. Finally, do a practice run with your co-host. Make sure that you understand how the features in the platform works and you're aware of what you're going to do in the event that you actually are experiencing some sort of Zoom bomb. Dave is going to talk a little bit about the different features that Zoom specifically has, but that a lot of video teleconferencing platforms do have in order to make sure that in the meeting, should something occur, you know exactly what to do. So Dave, can you talk a little bit about what happens in a meeting? Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren. So part of the important thing you want to do here is make sure that you treat this the same way that you would if you're thinking about any other kind of potential emergency that might occur during your event. So to reemphasize what Lauren said, do a couple of drills ahead of time with your co-hosts. Just make sure that you're handling this before you know where all the different features are, and you know how to kick somebody off, because these things, when they happen in real time, can be real adrenaline producing experiences. What do you actually need to do though? So the first thing is, if you're using the latest version of Zoom, you'll notice that if you're a co-host, you'll see a few new features and capabilities. The very first thing is just this security button here that I'm showing you, right? So you'll see here, these are actually the recommendations that we actually have for most of our public events, which is, you don't want to allow participants to share their screen. You don't want to necessarily allow them to chat with each other. Now that's entirely up to you, but what we have found is that for certain types of malicious trolls, they will use that chat feature to be able to say some pretty nasty things to participants. So it's up to you whether you want to turn that on or off, but if you want to, you can actually turn it off in the middle of a meeting using this security button. Whether or not you want to allow people to rename themselves or that they have to stay with the name that they started on is up to you as well. One of the big ones that we recommend though is keeping on this waiting room, and having the waiting room allows you and your co-hosts to be able to see when people are entering the meeting, look at what their name is, and then decide whether or not you actually want to allow them into the meeting or not. So what actually happens when you're in a meeting that is currently being Zoom bombed? So the first thing to do is to hit record. And when you hit record, you have the chance to either record to your own computer or record to the cloud. I would suggest actually recording to the cloud, as it's generally a bit safer. That sometimes recording to our computers can get lost. Start the recording going. It will enable you later, and law enforcement later, to go over and do a forensic analysis, which I know Daisha is going to talk about a bit later. The second thing that you want to do is bring up that security button here, and you want to look at this. Number one, I would lock the meeting. And locking the meeting means that's it. If you kick somebody off, they can't get back into the meeting. Number two, you want to actually go here and remove the participants who are showing up. This will bring up a participant window where you can actually just have a very quick button where you can hit remove, remove, remove. And often Zoom bombing doesn't, it's not an individual event. You'll have multiple people who may come in and try to do it at the same time. And then the last thing, and this is a very new feature that Zoom just launched as of this week in Zoom 5.0, is the ability to actually report someone. And here you can actually put in who you actually want to report. You can then talk about what was the problem. You can type in additional information, and you can also include a desktop screenshot as well, so that you can actually send all of that stuff, and that gets reported directly to Zoom so that they can take action, but it also helps to create a chain of evidence, and then you can send that in. So most important of all, though, I think, is just to relax, have some fun, make sure that you and your co-hosts have rehearsed this a couple of times so that you know what to do, so that in the moment you've got it all handled and you'll have a great meeting. And if you don't, Daisha is going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so in talking about Zoom bombing, it's important when we look at this, ultimately we want to help protect our communities. So if you were involved in an incident, and as Dave mentioned, recording an incident is very important to have that evidence for law enforcement to review to determine how they want to proceed with the information that you're presenting. So it is very important that you are ensuring that you preserve your information so that when it is presented to law enforcement, they can look at it and make the proper determinations as to how to charge it, how then to present it to a prosecutor to take that next step to filing criminal charges against the perpetrators of the act. ADL has great resources. If you see something and are not quite sure what you saw, we have great resources for hate crimes, for hate symbols that's available, and we routinely work with law enforcement in sharing information. So yeah, it's very important that once you have that recording or you have that information, that you preserve it, because it is the continuity of that that is going to be looked at and scrutinized by the court to see if they want to take the next steps to charge and prosecute folks. So it's important to be mindful of those things. Hey, Laura, can you remind me what we just talked about?
Thanks, Daisha. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so above all, have a plan. Make sure that you know the security protocols of whatever systems you might be using. Few things to keep in mind. One, make sure you've got co-hosts to work with you. Two, set up a waiting room. Three, make sure that you disable screen sharing and so that it's only usable by your co-hosts. And finally, preserve information if an incident does occur. We know that Zoom bombing can be traumatic, especially for historically targeted communities. So in addition to all of these prevention mechanisms that we are advising you to do, we also highly recommend that you leave room, you make space for debriefing if an incident occurs. ADL has lots of resources on Zoom bombing and other topics, so please visit us at adl.org. If you have any questions about Zoom bombing or if an incident occurs, reach out to us at education@adl.org. We hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful end of year celebrations. Thanks, ADL team, and thanks to all of you for joining us.